Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be discussing the 100 Years War on Palestine, a history of settler colonialism and resistance, 1917 through 2017, by Professor Rashid Khalidi. And this is the second book of Professor Khalidi's that I'm reviewing, but I've really enjoyed his work. And I would argue this might be a new one-volume text that you might want to send to people who are interested in learning about what has been going on in Palestine all these years. Now, I have been recommending Martin Button's very short introduction because it's only 120 pages, and I feel that that's something you can give to almost anybody. But this, even with its endnotes, takes you to about 300 pages. So it's not in itself a long read on the practical level. On the emotional level, it might be a more difficult read. Certainly was for me. Lately, I've been very focused on specific sections of my reading. So I've been reading books on 1948 or reading books on 1967. So I'm able to just be very focused on a particular period. But as this book progresses, things just continue to get worse for the Palestinians. And that's, in one sense, very discouraging. But on the other side of things, you also have more and more people becoming aware. And particularly in 2024, in the age of social media, when the Zionists are no longer in total control of what the media is allowed to say or print or put on video, we are learning more about the crimes of the IDF. The world is learning more about the crimes of the IDF, people who didn't even know what the IDF was, and seeing the murder of children and the murder of innocent civilians and the indiscriminate bombing of civilian targets in universities and hospitals. The narrative that was able to be established, that was able to be put out by the Zionists and their supporters from 1917 to 2017 is largely being eroded. Now, whether that leads to action, that's a different story, and that's maybe beyond the scope of this book. Professor Khalidi is just trying to give you his story, and in a sense, his story intertwined with this story because he was present during the bombing of Beirut in 1982. He was present in Madrid during he would largely characterize them as failed negotiations for the Palestinians. He had a chance to speak with Arafat on multiple occasions. So his personal story intertwined with his work as a historian is a unique and interesting perspective, and one of the reasons I really love this book and really would recommend it. I'm dividing, this is going to be part one, I'm dividing this into two parts. Professor Khalidi talks about 6 different wars on the Palestinian people. And so I'm going to go from 1917 to 1967 in this first review. And in the second review, I'll go beyond that period up till the book was published in 2020. But this time period, let's say it's from 1982 to 2014 in part 2. So we'll get to that. But let's go back to the beginning where we always have to start, which is with the Balfour Declaration. Significantly, the overwhelming Arab majority of the population, around 94% at that time, went unmentioned by Balfour, except in a backhanded way as the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. They were described in terms of what they were not, and certainly not as a nation or a people. The words Palestinian and Arab do not appear in the 67 words of the Declaration. This overwhelming majority of the population was promised only civil and religious rights, not political or national rights. By way of contrast, Balfour ascribed national rights to what he called the Jewish people, who in 1917 were a tiny minority, 6% of the country's inhabitants. So we can see right from the beginning, there is a basic lack of fairness in what the Balfour Declaration proposes. As soon as they were able to do so in the wake of World War I, Palestinians began to organize politically in opposition both to British rule and to the imposition of the Zionist movement as a privileged interlocutor of the British. Palestinians' efforts included petitions to the British, to the Paris Peace Conference, and to the newly formed League of Nations. Their most notable effort was a series of 7 Palestine Arab Congresses planned by a countrywide network of Muslim Christian societies and held from 1919 until 1928. These Congresses put forward a consistent series of demands focused on independence for Arab Palestine, rejection of the Balfour Declaration, support for majority rule, and ending unlimited Jewish immigration and land purchases. The Congresses established an Arab executive that met repeatedly with British officials in Jerusalem and in London, albeit to little avail. It was a dialogue of the deaf. The British refused to recognize the representative authority of the Congresses or its leaders, and insisted on Arab acceptance of the Balfour Declaration and the terms of the mandate that had succeeded it. the antithesis of every substantive Arab demand, as a precondition for discussion. The Palestinian leadership pursued this fruitless legalistic approach for over a decade and a half. And once again, there's no agreement on first principles. We always say this. We saw it all the way from this time period, 1917, all the way up to, let's say, Oslo and beyond, that the Palestinians have to accept the Zionists' framing of the situation, and only once that is accepted, then we can have a conversation. But that's crazy. The Zionists' demands and framework were asserted by the British, and not in any sort of natural or even human law, but just as an assertion. And I think we've seen over time just how problematic that has been. In 1922, the new League of Nations issued its mandate for Palestine, which formalized Britain's governance of the country. In an extraordinary gift to the Zionist movement, the mandate not only incorporated the text of the Balfour Declaration verbatim, it substantially amplified the declaration's commitments. The document begins with a reference to Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, which states that for certain communities, their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized. It continues by giving an international pledge to uphold the provisions of the Balfour Declaration. The clear implication of this sequence is that only one people in Palestine is to be recognized with national rights, the Jewish people. This was in contradistinction to every other Middle Eastern mandated territory where Article 22 of the Covenant applied to the entire population and was ultimately meant to allow for some kind of independence of these countries. 7 of the mandate's 28 articles are devoted to the privileges and facilities to be extended to the Zionist movement to implement the national home policy. The others deal with administrative and diplomatic matters, and the longest article treats the question of antiquities. The Zionist movement, in its embodiment in Palestine as the Jewish Agency, was explicitly designated as the official representative of the country's Jewish population, although before the mass immigration of committed European Zionists, the Jewish community comprised mainly either religious or Mizrahi Jews, who in the main were not Zionist or who even opposed Zionism. Of course, no such official representative was designated for the unnamed Arab majority. Article 7 provided for a nationality law to facilitate the acquisition of Palestinian citizenship by Jews. This same law was used to deny nationality to Palestinians who had emigrated to the Americas during the Ottoman era and now desired to return to their homeland. Thus, Jewish immigrants, irrespective of their origins, could acquire Palestinian nationality, while native Palestinian Arabs who happened to be abroad when the British took over were denied it. Finally, other articles allowed the Jewish Agency to take over or establish public works, allowed each community to maintain schools in its own language, which meant Jewish agency control over much of the yeshuv's school system, and made Hebrew an official language of the country. So you can see right away the status quo of the Zionist government in Israel today was set a long time ago. 1917 through 1939 is this first period that Professor Khalidi refers to. And if you look back in the history and you study it, you realize this isn't something that has come out of nowhere, and it has come from injustice from a long time ago. The second declaration of war obviously refers to 47 and 48, the end of the British Mandate, the proposed partition plan from UNSCOP, the semi-acceptance, I would say general acceptance of the Jews for this because it was more than they'd ever dreamed of, but the most right-wing elements rejected this idea. They wanted even more. And as far as the Palestinians, so you have to keep in mind, the Zionists are always going to say that this was rejected, quote unquote, by the Palestinians. However, there was no representative body of the Palestinians. They weren't allowed to do this during the mandate. So you cannot say that the Palestinians rejected this. What you do have is the Grand Mufti, who obviously wants to preserve at least as far as what the Arab designated areas are, but he doesn't really have an army that can go and invade the rest. And then you have a bunch of Arab countries who, for their own reasons, fumble the football, and I can talk about that more I have talked about it more in other reviews, but you can see for yourself what happened in 48 and the utter failure of the Arab armies, who were not really interested in helping the Palestinians. Almost all of the Arab armies as a whole were at the service of their governments who were interested more in what things look like than in actually helping the Palestinians. This isn't to impugn many of the soldiers, many of whom came as volunteers on their own money and came to help the Palestinians. I'm not questioning that. What I am questioning is the leadership. In many of these cases, both the political and the military leadership. As I read more about the war, I've realized just how much the Arabs ruined things for the Palestinians in 1948. But those are for different reviews and different discussions. So let me talk about what Professor Khalidi had to say. The November 29, 1947 passage in the UN General Assembly of Resolution 181, which called for dividing Palestine into a large Jewish state and a smaller Arab one, with an international corpus separatum encompassing Jerusalem, reflected the new global balance of power. The United States and USSR, which both voted in favor of the resolution, now clearly played the decisive role in sacrificing the Palestinians for a Jewish state to take their place and control over most of the country. The resolution was another declaration of war, providing the international birth certificate for a Jewish state in most of what was still an Arab-majority land, a blatant violation of the principle of self-determination enshrined in the UN Charter. The expulsion of enough Arabs to make possible a Jewish majority state necessarily and inevitably followed. Just as Balfour did not think that Zionism would hurt the Arabs, it is doubtful that when Truman and Stalin pushed through UNGA 181, UNGA, United Nations General Assembly 181, they or their advisors paid much heed to what would happen to the Palestinians as a consequence of their vote. And this is something we would see over and over, people always speaking for the Palestinians, acting on their behalf, but no one ever asking the Palestinians, no one ever giving them the authority to do so. And on the few times in which they do, for example, in the 2006 victory election for Hamas, their votes are not allowed. They are not allowed to vote because they voted the wrong way. So the injustice goes back to this time period and continues. In the wake of the defeat of the Arab armies and after massacres of civilians, an even larger number of Palestinians, another 400,000, were expelled and fled from their homes. This is obviously in addition to the original, let's say 300,000 in the first phase around May 15th. So in the second phase, after May 15th. Another 400,000 were expelled and fled from their homes, escaping to neighboring Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and the West Bank and Gaza. The latter two constituted the remaining 22% of Palestine that was not conquered by Israel. None were allowed to return, and most of their homes and villages were destroyed to prevent them from doing so. Still more were expelled from the new state of Israel even after the armistice agreements of 1949 were signed, while further numbers have been forced out since then. In this sense, the Nakba can be understood as an ongoing process. In a sense, he's right. It's not over. The Nakba continues to this moment in this hour. It's happening in the West Bank and it's happening in Gaza as I'm recording this. These shifts in opinion during and after World War II were enough to change the calculations of many American politicians. President Harry Truman, predisposed to Zionism through personal friendships and the influence of his closest advisors, was convinced that outright support of its aims was a domestic political necessity. In November 1945, only 9 months after Roosevelt had met and pledged his support to Ibn Saud, Truman bluntly revealed the motivations behind this major shift when a group of American diplomats presciently warned him that an overtly pro-Zionist policy would harm U.S. interests in the Arab world. "I am sorry, gentlemen," he said, "but I have to answer to hundreds of thousands who are anxious for the success of Zionism. I do not have hundreds of thousands of Arabs among my constituents." As the occupying Israeli troops swept through the Gaza towns and refuge camps of Khan Yunis and Rafah in November 1956, more than 450 people, male civilians, were killed, most of them summarily executed. According to a special report by the Director General of UNRWA, in the first massacre, which took place in Khan Yunis and the neighboring refugee camp on November the 3rd, 275 men were shot. 1 week later, on November 12th, in the Rafah camp, 111 were killed. Another 66 were shot between November the 1st and the 21st. I was present once when Muhammad El Farah, who represented Jordan at the UN, recalled how several of his cousins who lived in Khan Yunis had been rounded up and executed. Israel's claim that the Palestinian deaths were the result of clashes with troops searching for Fedayeen was decisively debunked by the UNRWA report. The civilians were killed after all resistance had ceased in the Gaza Strip, apparently as revenge for the raids into Israel before the Suez War. Given the precedent of 1948 and the civilian massacres at Dar Yassin and at least 20 other locations, and the 20 other locations that Professor Khalidi is referring to here is referencing the birth of the Palestinian refugee problem revisited, which I will also be reviewing. But Benny Morris is an Israeli historian documenting massacres at least 20 other locations. Remember, a lot of expulsion and massacre reports are classified by the IDF, and they are not allowed to be declassified currently. So at least 20, it's much, much more. As well as the high civilian casualties in the raids of the early 1950s, such as that at Kibya, the gruesome events in the Gaza Strip were not isolated incidents. They were part of a pattern of behavior by the Israeli military. News of the massacres was suppressed in Israel and veiled by a complacent American media. As I said, can't do that anymore. Social media age is here. So moving on to 1967, which up to this point is perhaps the time I have least covered on the channel. I will get to it, I promise. I just had to equip myself with, I didn't want to get into 67, the 70s and the 80s, even Oslo and beyond without really getting to understand the history. And that's why I've been there. So I just ask you with me, we will get to 67 and beyond. But for the moment, I'm still trying to make sure that we've laid the groundwork as a channel, as we're all learning together. What is it that gets us here? If we don't understand how we got to 1967, we're not really going to understand 1967. Because 1967, you have to understand, it's really just a continuation. There was, you could say, a giant pause button. The Israeli military became supercharged in a way. The Arab militaries just mediocred on. And 67 was a continuation of 48. Government documents published since then have confirmed these judgments. U.S. military and intelligence sources predicted a crushing victory by Israel in any and all circumstances, given the mastery enjoyed by its armed forces. 5 years after the 1967 war, 5 Israeli generals echoed the U.S. assessment, stating in different venues that Israel was not imperiled by annihilation, which was the narrative they were giving out in the media. Poor us, we had to defend ourselves, they were going to kill us. They weren't going to kill you in 1948, and they certainly weren't going to kill you in 1967. It was totally a lie, but when they were able to control the media narrative, they were able to put that story out. On the contrary, its forces were much stronger than the Arab armies in 1967, and the country was never in any danger of losing a war, even if the Arabs had struck first. Yet the myth prevails. In 1967, a tiny, vulnerable country faced constant existential peril, and it continues to do so. This fiction has served to justify blanket support of Israeli policies, no matter how extreme, and despite its repeated rebuttal, even by authoritative Israeli voices. Remember, when an Israeli speaks up, they have to be called anti-Semitic and self-loathing. Criticism of Israel is never permitted. You have to understand that. It's never permitted. Ever. Particularly by Israelis. Minor though the incident was, the ambassador's performance betokened a major shift in the United States policies toward Israel. What we had witnessed that day was evidence of a new Middle Eastern axis in action. The armed spearheads on the ground were Israeli, while the diplomatic cover was American. It is an axis that is still in place today, over a half-century later. The shift, which had been underway for some time, was mainly due to global factors, notably the impact of the Cold War and the Vietnam War on the region and on U.S. policy, but also to significant personal and political considerations in Washington. Evolving in parallel were Israel's external alliances, whereby it decisively moved away from its patrons of the 1950s and early 1960s, France and Britain, with whose weapons it fought the 1956 and 1967 wars, to a complete alignment with the United States. All of these factors had coalesced by June of 1967, before the start of the war, when the Israeli government sought and received a green light from Washington to launch a preemptive attack on the air forces of Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Moreover, by linking Israel's withdrawals from occupied territories to the creation of secure and recognized boundaries, SC 242 allowed the Security Council resolution, SC 242, allowed for the possibility of enlarged Israeli borders to meet the criterion of security as determined by Israel. This nuclear-armed regional superpower has subsequently deployed an extraordinarily expansive and flexible interpretation of the term. Finally, the ambiguous language of SC 242 left open another loophole for Israel to retain the territories it had just occupied. The resolution's English text specifies withdrawal from territories occupied in the 1967 war, rather than from the territories occupied. Now, for those of you who aren't native English speakers, just listening to that difference, withdrawal from territories occupied versus withdrawal from the territories occupied. The territories occupied would seem to imply what had just happened, versus territories occupied is ambiguous. It could be what just happened, or it could be from time before. Abba Eban pointedly stressed to the Security Council that his government would regard the original English language text as binding, rather than the equally official French version, whose wording des territoires occupés does not permit this ambiguity. So that article doesn't exist in the French version. In the half-century since, with American help, Israel has driven a coach and horses through this linguistic gap, which has permitted it to colonize the occupied Palestinian and Syrian territories, some of which, East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights, it has formerly annexed, and to maintain its unending military control over them. Repeated United Nations condemnations of these moves, unsupported by even a hint of sanctions or any genuine pressure on Israel, have over time amounted to tacit international acceptance of them. Because the reality is what? Most of these countries are unwilling to engage in BDS against the Zionists. They're not willing to boycott, divest, and sanction, as they did against South Africa. So it isn't as if countries haven't been involved in coordinated international actions before. They just can't against the Israelis because they will be accused of being anti-Semitic. And as we know, that is the worst thing that you can be called in the whole world. There is another side to the story of what happened in 1967, however. For all the harm the war and SC 242 did to the Palestinians, they ultimately served as the spark to their reviving national movement, which had been declining since the defeat of the 1936-39 revolt. The process of revival had started well before the 1967 war, of course, playing a crucial role in precipitating that and the 1956 war. Still, 1967 marked an extraordinary resurgence of Palestinian national consciousness and resistance to Israel's negation of Palestinian identity, a negation made possible by the complicity of much of the world community. In the words of one seasoned observer, a central paradox of 1967 is that by defeating the Arabs, Israel resurrected the Palestinians. And I think it's a wonderful turn of phrase, and it couldn't possibly be more true. Although under Carter, the United States had come close to endorsing the Palestinians' national rights and their involvement in negotiations, the two sides found themselves farther apart than ever. Camp David and the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty signaled U.S. alignment with the most extreme expression of Israel's negation of Palestinian rights, an alignment that was consolidated by Ronald Reagan's administration. Begin and his successors in the Likud, Yitzhak Shamir, Ariel Sharon, and then Benjamin Netanyahu, were implacably opposed to Palestinian statehood, sovereignty, or control of the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. Ideological heirs of Ze'ev Jabotinsky, they believed that the entirety of Palestine belonged solely to the Jewish people and that a Palestinian people with national rights did not exist. At most, autonomy might be possible for the local Arabs, but this autonomy would apply only to the people, not to the land. Their explicit aim was to transform the entirety of Palestine into the land of Israel. Via the treaty with Egypt, Begin ensured that nothing would interfere with the implementation of the Likud vision. The foundation he had cannily laid down, which was adopted by the United States, formed the basis of everything that would follow. Future negotiations would be restricted to the terms of self-rule for an infinitely extendable interim period, and exclude any discussion of sovereignty, statehood, Jerusalem, the fate of refugees, and jurisdiction over the land, water, and air of Palestine. Meanwhile, Israel set about reinforcing its colonization of the occupied territories. In spite of occasional meek American and Egyptian protestations, the conditions imposed by Begin set the ceiling of what the Palestinians were allowed to negotiate for. And that gets us to the end of this first part. So obviously I'd said 1917 to 1939, then 1947 to 1948. This 1967 period takes us to the Sadat, Begin, Carter negotiation. So in part 2, I'm going to obviously go on from that. If you like what you heard so far, please hit like, hit subscribe, share this with someone who is open-minded and interested to learn more about the situation. You can send a super thanks if you want to show your gratitude for this particular video. If you'd like to get involved with more videos in the future, if you'd like to potentially sponsor a video, consider supporting my Patreon and my YouTube members. You'll get early access to videos like this, as well as be part of discussions and polls that I try to conduct in the community there. Remember also that there's an Amazon wish list if you'd like to buy some other books to add them to my list. As I said, I've got plenty to get me through to the end of 2024, but we don't know how 2025 is mapping out yet. So feel free to maybe put a nomination in there by buying a book from the Amazon wish list. And a reminder that in 2024, a portion of the proceeds from any of these particular channels is going to go towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which provides medical care to children in Palestine who could not otherwise receive it. As always, enjoy your reading.